Hey there, welcome to Goblin Girl Studio. Today I'm going to take a bunch of worthless trash, like brand new wire, unused cushion foam, and nice fabrics, and turn it into something useful and important, like this posable little conspiracy theorist mole. Okay, first step, we gotta figure out the vibe. So I really wanted to find a way to combine the conspiracy theorist, fedora, cargo shorts, insecurity meets magical thinking vibe with the cute little animals who dress like fancy 1900s gentlemen, Wind in the Willows, Beatrix Potter, Brambly Hedge vibe. And in between those is... we're gonna find out. I think it's gonna be all about how he sees himself. So he'd probably think of himself as like a real detective uncovering the truth. So I'm gonna try putting him in like a Sherlock Holmes type outfit, but I want him to be kind of sloppy at the same time, like he's missed a button on his coat and his tie's all askew. And of course I want to add a fedora. Maybe I can also add like cargo short pockets on his coat, maybe? With the design finished, I sketch out a blueprint for this little guy's wire skeleton, also known as the armature. Creatively, this armature was made out of armature wire, and also copper wire. I cut lengths of wire for the spine, arms, and legs and group them together. Then I lashed those bundles together with thread. It's this really delicate balance of wanting the wires to be stuck pretty firmly together, but also be able to slide against each other as they bend. Now I take out all of my bottled up rage onto these wires to bend them into the shape that I want for the arms and the spinal column, leaving a little loop at the bottom for the leg wires to go through. To stick them together, I sprinkle on some baking soda and then open up my super glue. Oh my god.
You got it?
Yeah.
Wow. Nice.
Thanks. Then I add a couple of drops to make both a stronghold and a nice dose of cyanide gas. To make the pelvis and rib cage, I mixed up equal parts of plumber's epoxy and then started glomming it on all over the wires. It'll be rock hard once it's set and serve as good touch points for posing this little guy once he's done. Once that has had at least an hour to set, I trim the arm wires down to the right length, then I pull out this interlocking brass tubing. I love this stuff because it's so great for making replaceable body parts. Let's do this for the hands. I cut the wider tube with my handsaw, so enjoy some ASMR. Then I file down the edges and use my third toxic adhesive in 3 minutes to attach them to the arm wires. And now for the legs. I bent them both into a rough mammalian shape, and it may or may not have taken me like 45 minutes to get them to actually match. Then I'm using these little T-nuts as the base of the feet for this little guy so that I can bolt him down in a diorama using a screw and a wing nut. So I push one between each set of foot wires, then trim the wires to size around it. I protect my holes with tape and then cover it all with a light dusting of baking soda and cyanide. With those attached, I screw him down so that I can start sculpting his feet. I'll be using Magic Sculpt, which is basically epoxy putty that is sculptable and takes longer to cure, and I wrongly thought it didn't require gloves. Turns out it does, so I'm posting this video from inside craft jail. I promise to wear gloves from now on. Just please let me out. To sculpt a nice juicy mole foot, I start with a foot-sized lump, and then I add on some like clay wormies where the foot knuckles would go. Then I smooth those out, and I rough out the individual toes. And once I have those piggies exactly where I want them, I cut out the toenails and smooth out the space between the toes. Even tinier epoxy wormies help me define the toenails, and then I just refine the details and smooth it out. And voila, sexy little mole feet ready for pics. Okay, so before we go any further, I have a confession to make. I made this armature once before. I cut the wires, I sculpted the feet, I made his head, and I was putting the foam on him when I realized I had used the wrong kind of wires and both of his arms had already broken and I had to start all over again. The only thing I could salvage was his head. So here, enjoy some footage from the past. All you really need to know is that when I made the back of the head on my last armature, I made it so that the face could be replaceable using a system of grooves and magnets. And then I started sculpting over the top of that so that the face would just lock into place. And I love face sculpting. I feel like this is where I really get to meet the little character that I'm making. Maybe it's because I'm not a super practiced sculptor, but I feel it's like 50% me making decisions and sculpting and 50% of the clay figure just revealing himself to me as I go along. He's getting an anxious expression for his first face that I'm making him because I think he would be so stressed out about how he thinks everyone is plotting against him. I started out by using Magic Sculpt to make his face, which only has about an hour of working time, and I definitely didn't sculpt it fast enough. Also, I realized too late that his eyes were really uneven from the top view. When I compared it to a test sculpt that I'd made with Sculpey off camera, I decided that I liked the Sculpey one way more actually. It just had so much more personality and a sense of weight and gravity to the form, so I decided to switch and just finish the Sculpey one instead. To start, I poured myself a little shot of alcohol and used it to smooth out the unfinished side of his face. I added his little beady eye, and I tried to use some little teeth that I pre-baked, but they kind of made him look like a mole vampire, so I switched to a more cartoony triangle-shaped teeth. Next, I borrowed my partner's toothbrush, and I used it to stipple on some nice rough texture onto the tip of the mole's nose. And once that was looking good, I politely returned it before he even noticed it was gone. I'm always super nervous about Sculpey burning or cracking in the oven, but a couple of bakes and a burial shroud later, he seems to have survived okay. And I think that he turned out really cute. Now with that done, let's go back to the future. Present? I mean, I'm editing this like 2 months later, so it's all the past to me. Either way, in this timeline, the head mount that attached to this face is now rotting in the trash, so we gotta reverse engineer it for a new armature. This basically entails covering the head in saran wrap, throwing down some magnets over the ones embedded into the face, then covering up the back with some magic sculpt. I pressed the neck wires of the armature into it, let it cure for a few hours, and then it was a perfect fit once again. That done, we're on to foam. For this step of the build, I use 1/2 inch cushion foam, EVA foam, and this super porous squishy foam. I don't know what it's called. I get all this from the scrap pile at my local foam mart, but if you don't have a foam mart, maybe you could slice off just like a little bit of your roommate's couch without them noticing? Okay, so let me explain the 3 different kinds of foam. The black EVA foam is to bulk out an area and make it stiffer. This is for like where the bones would be basically. And then the spongy foam is to bulk out areas but remain fully flexible. I only really use this for going inside the abdomen. I even score little lines going through it to try to make it even more flexible than it already is. I glue these on around the wires with barge glue and then trim them up until I get the rough shape I'm looking for. And then the cushion foam, which I think is actually called polyurethane, is for creating the overall shape of the body while keeping it as flexible as possible. I coat pretty much the entire mole with it until he looks like Randy from A Christmas Story, and then it's the fun part where I trim all the excess foam away to reveal the little mole inside. Most importantly, gotta carve him a little butt. After refining all the details, he's actually looking like a little guy. That's so cool. And with that done, we're on to the hands. Okay, so remember those square brass tubes from earlier? Now I cut some pieces of the slightly smaller brass tubes to fit inside the ones on the arms. To make the hands, I cut 3 wires and I fold them in half. I put them all in a bundle and then I take one of the strands and I use it to lash them all together. I spread the fingers out based on a schematic that I drew last minute when I realized that I needed one, and then use that wrapping wire to go back and forth across the hand to make a rough palm shape. Next, I marked out how long I would want the fingers to be, and I cut off the excess. I made a little loop at the end of the wire so that it won't poke through the eventual latex coating, spoiler, and then I made a bigger loop as the base for his long mole nails. With the hand armature done, I used some of that good old liquid epoxy to glue the wrist wires into the brass tubes we cut earlier. For his little claws, I used a couple of passes of magic sculpt so that I wouldn't have to worry about them cracking when I posed his hands. Done with the hand skeleton, I move on to the muscles. For this next step, I used more of that cushion foam trimmed down to a very wobbly 1/8 of an inch, and liquid latex, which I think is normally used for like special effects makeup. I cut out mole palm sized pieces of foam, dabbed them with latex, and then squished them together around the wires of the hand until they stuck. Next came foam around each finger, then a little ring around the base of the nails to give them a more dimensional shape. And now that I have the general shape of the hand worked out, I just go around adding little pieces of foam to fill out all the details. I pay special attention to the palm and the knuckles. This is the fun part, basically sculpting with foam. It's really cool to see these come together. Once all 4 hands were done, I took out my most relatable empty food jar and filled it with enough liquid latex to dunk the whole hands into. I added some crappy acrylic paints to the jar until I got to the desired pink mole skin color I was looking for. And from there, it's super simple. I just dunk the hands into the latex, scrape off the excess on the nails, let it dry, and then repeat 2 more times. I love this technique for making hands. It's so simple, I don't need any molds, the material isn't toxic, and it turns out nice and smooth. I feel like this is like a miracle of the crafting world, but I don't ever see people using it. And not to brag, but I think I'm pretty good at this technique, so let me tell you the secret. It's all about the foam base. The more care and love and detail you put into that, the better the hand will turn out. After 3 passes of latex, the base of the hands were done, so I started to paint the nails. First, I gave them a coat of watered-down matte Mod Podge to prime them, then I coated them in like a bone white color. I added some shading at the base so they looked a little bit dirty, and then dry brushed some highlights onto the edges. Last layer is some more watered-down matte Mod Podge. I wanted to see if I could get a bit of color variation on the hands, so I stippled on a thin layer of slightly pinker latex onto the knuckles. I'm mostly happy with the results. It ended up with a little bit of a bumpy texture, but it's not too noticeable. Then, once everything was dry, I cut off all the excess latex drippings going down the brass tubes. And then for one final but very important step, baby powder. A light dusting of this will reduce the shine and help the hands look more like skin and less like latex. And then the hands are done. I really love how they turned out. It's so cool to be able to get something this smooth and also fully posable. Next up, painting. I feel like there's not much to really explain with painting. It's just dabbing colors on back and forth over and over again until it looks right. I really have no insights for you here. It's just Mod Podge and crappy craft store paints. So I think that instead, this is maybe a good opportunity for me to talk a little bit about who this guy is and what I'm doing with all this. So let me tell you all about this little guy who I'm calling Molten. I think he would see himself as like the detective of the community. He probably thinks that he's super observant and clever and skilled with hand-to-hand combat, which he would like to demonstrate for you at a very close range. If your prized cherry tart goes missing or you suspect your squirrel wife is cheating on you, you call Molten. I wouldn't say he's terribly good at solving the actual case at hand, but he's great at making up new, completely fictional, and only tangentially related issues created whole cloth from his intrusive thoughts. If he happens to find that your squirrel wife is not in fact cheating, but instead has developed a habit of sneaking out late at night to steal and eat prized cherry tarts, well, that's a practically irrelevant detail in the much larger case of everyone is plotting to make cherry tarts which they know are my favorites and not share them with me as a punishment because I ate more than my fair share of the potluck on Tuesday. Mostly, his conspiracies come down to not being able to believe that everyone else actually likes him as much as they do. The only being that he loves and trusts implicitly is his beloved pet beetle, who is constantly trying to escape. This little mole is just one of a whole community of critters that I've been making, along with dioramas of their little nests, mole holes, caves, etc. I might end up using these as a way to make photo illustrations for a picture book, or maybe it'll only live on YouTube. Like and subscribe for more. I'm not sure, but for right now, I guess I'm just making this little world because I feel strangely compelled to do it. I'm kind of scared of social media, and I've just spent hours editing this video and listening to my own voice and thinking it's the most annoying sound in the world, but I'm hoping that maybe it'll be worth it to share all this with someone else, you know? And since if I only did one thing I'd go crazy, I'll probably also be making other crafting content type videos in between these, like various costuming and miniatures projects, so I hope you'll stick around. Now that you know all about Molten, let's get back to it with the step I've been dreading the most, the fur. So I've never put fur on a character like this before, so I'm kind of nervous about how it's gonna turn out. I've watched a bunch of videos of other creators making furry characters on YouTube though, so I'm hoping that that knowledge will transfer over somehow. I'm starting with the easy part of putting faux fur on the back of the head and neck. I'm just gluing strips down with barge glue at the base of the head and stitching up the sides so that there won't be any gaps when he's posed later. It kind of looks like he has a receding hairline, but I think that's what he's supposed to look like at this stage, so I'm just gonna trim the fur and keep going. For the fur on his face, I think I'm going to work from back to front because of the direction of his fur pattern. It kind of allows me to lay bits of hair on top of each other in layers. I start with big strips of fur to go around the face and then littler ones going around his cheeks and nose bridge. But the strips of faux fur have kind of a chunky nap on the bottom, and I don't want anyone to be able to see it, so for this next layer, I'm painstakingly cutting off tiny tufts of fur and gluing them onto the face as vertically as I can. I was only covering like a couple of millimeters at a time, so this kind of took forever. He's kind of looking like a crazed guinea pig, but I'm hoping that once his fur is trimmed, I'll see the vision a little bit more. And this is where I'm really starting to sweat, because this looks pretty chunky to me, and I'm getting that itch to pull all of the fur off and redo it. But I don't have any ideas of how I would do it differently, so all I can do is keep going. Maybe the flocking will save this? I carefully dab some glue onto his face, sprinkle the flocking, dust it off, and then repeat a few more times until I feel like his hairline is as natural as I can make it. And here is where I go into a full-blown crafting spiral, and I think that it looks awful and that there's nothing I could ever do to fix it. But before I rip it all off and start over, it doesn't hurt to try one more thing that might save it, but will most likely ruin it. So I use my partner's toothbrush to slick the hair back with watered-down Mod Podge. And wait a second, I think this actually worked? Crisis averted? I decided to flock a little closer to his eyes, lint roll his little butt, and slick back the hair on his neck a bit too. Okay, I'm actually really happy with this. And with that behind me, now I can start the second most dreaded step, making the clothes. First, I decided that I wanted all the fabric I bought to be just a little darker than it already was, so I put it into a forbidden soup of brown dye to cook for a little bit. And it's definitely darker than when it started. It wasn't a waste of time, I swear. Joanne's selection of sewing patterns for moles was really limited, so I had to make my own. I started by making the pattern for his pants, and I honestly just kind of guessed based on what I remember pants patterns looking like, and then just holding pieces up to him to see if I was right. Once I felt good about the pattern, I traced the pieces on another sheet of paper, added the seam allowance, cut them out, and then used masking tape to pop them down onto my fabric and cut out the pieces. I put fray check around all the edges to help keep the fabric from unraveling while I sewed it. It took a little mental math to figure out which seams on the pants went together and which I should sew first, but I think I got it right. They ended up being way too big on him, so I took them in on the sides. And as soon as I did that, I realized that I needed to seam rip the sides completely to sew on the little cuffs of his pants. This definitely is not how you would do real cuffs on a real pair of pants, but to be fair, A, I was too lazy to look it up, and B, I figured it was so tiny that I'd have to do it differently anyway. That's probably not true, but see answer A again. I sewed down the top edge of the pants that no one will ever see, and then I was done. I feel like they look pretty cute on him. Next, I wanted an undershirt to peek out beneath his coat. It doesn't need to be a real shirt, and honestly that much fabric around his arms and armpits would probably be bulky and limit his movements, so I decided to basically make him a dickie. I sewed the back and two front pieces together, then sewed up the outside corners of the collar. I pinned and sewed those together, hemmed all the edges, and then sewed the two front halves of the shirt closed. Cute! I'm not a great seamstress, and I haven't made that many patterns before, so this is going suspiciously well. I'm fully expecting everything to fall apart as I work on the next most important piece, the coat. I start with sewing together the back panels, then the front pieces, and the sleeves. I sew on some sleeve cuffs, and oh my goodness, look at how straight and close to the edge these top stitches are. What is happening? How am I even doing this? I sewed the pieces together for the little cape, and I swear to God I am not trying to brag, but somehow the stitches look great on the cape too. Like how? I attached the cape to the jacket, and then the collar. I stitched up the sides, and it's really starting to look like a little Inverness coat. While top stitching the edges, my sewing machine started jamming, but just chaotically poking around in it seemed to help, and I was able to finish without too much more fuss. And finally, I could sew the last pieces, the pockets. I really wanted these to be like cargo short pockets, so I made a little pleat in the front for added carrying capacity, hemmed the top, then added the little side seams. They were just a bit too finicky to try to sew on by machine, so I stitched them on by hand. With those done, I was on to the pocket flaps. I tried to get the corners as sharp as possible, slapped on another beautiful top stitch, and then sewed them onto the coat. Oh, it looks so cute. Let's add a tie. I took some extra ribbon from an old project and cut out a tie shape. Fray check made sure that the cut edge didn't unravel. Tying a tie this tiny was kind of tricky, so good thing I wanted him to be kind of askew anyway. And finally, I put on these adorable tiny buttons. I sewed the buttons on the top flap of the first pocket so it looked like it was buttoned shut, but on the other pocket I sewed one of the buttons onto the pocket itself and embroidered a faux buttonhole on the flap, which I felt pretty clever about. I sewed the top and bottom buttons on the left side of the coat, and then measured out where the 3 others should be in between them. I embroidered another faux buttonhole on the right side of the coat, and then immediately pulled it out because I realized that the buttonholes would actually be on the left side. I'm embroidering a buttonhole because I want it to look like he skipped a button on his jacket on accident to add a more off-kilter feel. I sewed the jacket closed and it was done. Honestly, this has got to be the cleanest sewing I've ever done. I should probably be a bit more humble, but I felt like a crafting god after making this outfit. It's so much better than I had imagined. And I'm going to carry that energy into the final step, which is making his little hat. So, while learning millinery from scratch just to make one tiny fedora does sound like something I would do, I was just too excited to finish this up to learn a whole new craft. Instead, I decided to just use this little felt hat I found at the craft store as a base. Okay, so maybe you've noticed by now that I talk a lot when I'm nervous, and I've been really nervous making this whole video, and the process of making this next step is just gluing fabric to a hat, so I'm going to be quiet for a minute and let you listen to the music that my partner Jakey made for this video. So this hat actually turned out a lot nicer than I thought it would. And with that, we are finished and on to the reveal. I can't even begin to say how happy I am with how this little guy turned out. This is one of those projects where each step turned out just a little bit better than I had expected, and so the sum of all of his parts just totally outshines my initial vision. Some of my next projects will be making his little pet beetle and his conspiracy theorist molehole and other various cottagecore related crafts and projects. So if that's anything you'd be interested in seeing, please consider subscribing, and please let me know what you thought about Molten, and if you have any ideas for what his last name should be, because I'm still deciding. Thanks to my partner Jakey for making all the music for this video, and thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you next time at Goblin Girl Studio.